Well, I think the American public is waking up to the fact that we're giving away our democracy, we're giving away our sovereignty to a secretive group of people who make the rules. And those rules are not based on our values of protecting the environment, of protecting human rights. It's based on trade and profit and nothing else.
Mostly what concerns me is the corporations taking over what the little man has been running all this time.
Look at the collaboration here in Seattle. This is a collaboration that I suspect has great multiplying effects. I think this one has got stamina, or as they say in sports, it's got legs. I think this one has legs because it offends people. It offends their very sense of what they would like the world to be. But more important, what they would want the world to be left with.
As a result of the war, corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow. And the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed.
In 1995, the World Trade Organization, or WTO, was established by an agreement between 125 nations. Its function is to create and enforce rules of international trade, which proponents say are for the betterment of humankind. Critics charge, however, that the WTO largely serves multinational corporations running roughshod around the planet. In late 1999, the WTO held a ministerial meeting in Seattle, Washington. I, along with tens of thousands of other people, also gathered in Seattle to express reservations. Here, then, were some of our concerns.
I've spent nearly 20 years as a lawyer trying to obtain strong health and environmental protections in this country and then trying to get them enforced. It's always been hard work because there are moneyed interests, well-connected moneyed interests on the other side every time. But it is nothing compared to trying to defend those laws when they're challenged before the World Trade Organization. The environmental challenge to the WTO can be summarized by a Cree Indian prophecy. Only after the last tree has been cut down, only after the last river has been poisoned, only after the last fish has been caught, only then will you find that money cannot be eaten. The WTO is putting the world on the path feared in this prophecy. It puts trade ahead of people and the planet. This bias is evident in how the WTO operates. The decision makers are trade officials, not environmental ministers, not health officials, trade ministers. They meet in secret. They do not get input from the public, from interested non-governmental organizations. Non-governmental organizations cannot be part of the proceedings, which is a contrast to the way almost all other international institutions work. And when disputes arise, they're decided by 3 trade experts who meet in secret. There's another set of rules that stands in the way of health and environmental protections. The WTO does not recognize what's called the precautionary principle. It might be best understood as the old adage, better safe than sorry. And you heard Jose Bove describe the Europeans' desire to apply that principle and ban hormones in beef. And the WTO said Europe went too far. And let me tell you why. The hormones have been shown to cause cancer in animals. But the WTO wanted evidence that they would cause cancer to people when they're eaten. We don't generally do those kinds of tests on people. We don't usually wait for that kind of proof. But the WTO wanted more definitive proof that people would be harmed when they ate the beef. The struggle is often over who has the burden of proof and who's going to bear the risk. In this country, we've often put the burden on public health. The WTO's threat to the environment is not hypothetical. In less than 5 years that the WTO has been around, it has repeatedly collided with the environment, and every time the environment has lost. These same rules hamper a country's ability to guard against invasive pests. And this could be the biggest threat to our forests in this country, is critters that would come in on traded goods and cause an epidemic in our forests. In the area of wood imports, the United States is playing catch-up to trade. Our amount of imports that are coming in have increased in the last decade by huge amounts. And the first time we regulated to try to keep out invasive pests was in 1995. Environmentalists went to court and challenged the regulations, saying it didn't go far enough. And the U.S. government said the WTO keeps us from having more stringent regulations.
"20 years ago or so, when we first began in RAFI to monitor what was happening in the seed industry, we actually had to track 7,000 different public and private seed companies around the world. But this year, the top 10 seed companies on this planet will have about 40% of the global commercial market in seed. Just 10 companies. Today, the top 10 veterinary medicine companies on this planet, again, occupy 2/3 of the global market, actually 69% of the global market for veterinary medicines, just 10 companies. 20 years ago, there were 65 pesticide manufacturers around the world who are all innovative and developing new pesticides. So now we're down to 9. In pharmaceuticals, this year, the top 10 companies will come very close to half of the global market for pharmaceuticals. Just 10. From 20 that had 5% down to 10 that have almost 50% this year. Where do we take all of this? I think it's to challenge the right of the WTO to take over agricultural issues and to undermine food security. In 1996, at the World Food Summit that was held in Rome, the United States government took the initiative in trying to stop food to be regarded as a human right. It took the initiative in trying to prevent that. It didn't succeed in the end, but it did mute the text enormously. But the United States did get agreement from other governments that in fact food security no longer requires that you produce your own food. As long as you're able to buy it from some other country, then you still have food security according to the US rules. Now, that was bad enough. But if even the food you grow in your own country is dependent upon trader technologies from the other country, then you've lost that food security as well. Then the entire food system is in the hands of that handful of companies. And that's outrageous. That shouldn't be allowed. At the end of the Thanksgiving weekend, after everybody has all talked about these things and perhaps said as a ritual the Lord's Prayer, please remember that the prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread," should not be a prayer to the WTO or to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Thank you.
Hunger is really the paradox of plenty. Hunger amidst abundance. Boosting crop yields by 25% is not going to change a situation where too many people can't buy the food that's already available, or too many people have been displaced from their ancestral farmland and are therefore unable to use any agricultural technology, traditional or bioengineered. People know how to grow food. Farmers know how to grow food. But when they have to compete with Cargill and Archer Daniels Midland, who get preferential treatment in their own country, that makes it pretty difficult. We hear all the time about miracle technologies that are going to produce electrical power basically for free, for pennies, nuclear power. It was supposed to be harmless. It was supposed to revolutionize our lives. Pesticides were originally supposed to resolve all of the pest problems of the world's farmers. Mere pennies, alleviate the drudgery of farm work, and we're supposed to be harmless. We're supposed to take care of the hunger problem in the world because of their ability to boost production. Well, today, it's genetically modified seeds, transgenics. Seeds that have genes moved across the species barrier, some that contain their own pesticide, some that are tolerant of herbicide. And the same companies, the very same companies, once told us that pesticides were safe, that pesticides would end hunger, now tell us that genetically modified crops are safe, that genetically modified crops will end hunger. The question is, should we believe them this time around?
Biotechnologists, it seemed to me, want to have it both ways. They want to get lots of people to invest in it because it's a growth area on the stock market, saying that it is a revolutionary science with enormous potential. But when critics then suggest that there are maybe equally dangerous possibilities, they say, no, 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 this isn't revolutionary stuff at all. It happens in nature. It's just DNA. We're just moving DNA around. And that happens in nature all the time. Well, I don't think you can have it both ways. It can't be revolutionary on the one hand, but not on the other. It is revolutionary. And it is revolutionary because in nature, genes don't normally transfer laterally or horizontally across species boundaries. We simply don't have the knowledge to be able to anticipate what the consequences of this kind of engineering will be. And I take what is a very moderate position, it seems to me, and that is in view of the fact of the enormous potential, as was cited by the chair here, of these organisms behaving much like an alien species in a new environment. The ecological consequences of the transgenic organisms, I think, are immense. And the health aspects, of course, at this point, we have no idea. So until we know in more detail what the basis either for the benefits or the hazards, we ought to keep this stuff confined to the lab. Now in Canada, we've gone far too far. This has been slipped into the food stream. There are over 40 different GMOs already in our diets. We have no labeling. There has been no public discussion about this. And my position is, at the very, very least, there should be mandatory labels.
Our next speaker is Cipriano Giurado, and she'll have a translator with her, Victor Manati, who's the Environment Director of the IFG. She worked in the maquiladoras in Mexico for 10 years, including General Electric, Ford, and Semiconductores Ópticos. Under this last employer, she was fired for trying to organize her co-workers to improve conditions in the factory and in the maquiladoras.
Nosotras y nosotros queremos denunciar cómo las políticas de estos organismos de comercio.
We have to figure out how the different rules of the World Trade Organization that govern trade and investment
está haciendo que la vida de millones de mujeres, niños y niñas y hombres en este mundo esté terminando muy mal.
and how this is affecting the lives and the livelihoods and health of these different communities throughout the world, and having big effects in actually killing people.
Con las políticas que le dan a los diferentes gobiernos, ellos están bajando los apoyos al gasto social.
And how our governments are not including the cost to these bad policies.
Y en el marco de esta reunión, pues estamos denunciando toda la violencia que las mujeres estamos viviendo, especialmente en mi ciudad, en Ciudad Juárez, donde han asesinado más de 195 mujeres.
And we took this opportunity to call attention to the particularly violent situation that women in the border region are living. In her city alone, in Ciudad Juárez, more than 195 women have been killed in the last 4 years.
la mayoría de ellas trabajadoras, mujeres pobres que trabajan en la maquiladora.
The majority of them are poor women who work in the maquilas.
Y que han sido asesinadas brutalmente después de violarlas.
And who have been brutally assassinated and raped.
La mayoría de ellas entre 14 y 20 años.
The majority of them less than 24 years old.
Y este tipo de violencia en contra de las mujeres y las niñas es lo que ocasionan las políticas del Banco Mundial, de la OMC.
And we connect this violent treatment of women specifically to policies of the World Bank and to the World Trade Organization.
Right now, our delegation has 40 people in it, coming from at least 25 countries. And we are pushing for increased consideration by the trade negotiators of the environmental and social impacts of global rules on communities, especially in southern countries. Coming from a southern NGO and trying to lobby with trade officials and trying to influence trade policy at this level, at the international level, is a very frustrating task, because in a lot of ways it's very, very, very much divorced already from the real concerns that our partner communities have to deal with, which is the very survival of their own community. The Philippines is a poor country. Our per capita income, per capita GNP is something like $1,000 a year. And we have the poverty rate is something like 30%, because these are economic policies that have in a lot of cases resulted to extreme economic and social distress, as well as ecological distress. It's also a responsibility of the American people to try to exert more control over what your own government does and what your own corporations do in countries that do not have sufficient economic or political clout to defend themselves against the U.S. government, against U.S. corporations.
What we are seeing right now in the area of patenting, which is preventing farmers from saving seed and has turned seed saving into a crime, which is forcing countries like India to dismantle its intellectual property rights system, its patent systems that ensure that we have cheap medicine accessible to all, that we do not patent life forms, we do not patent basic agricultural commodities, we do not patent medicines and have product patents on them. All those structures are under dismantling, and every country, all of Africa, India, and the Central American countries, rightful demand for change has been stamped out by the so-called democracy at work within the WTO. The rules of WTO are wrong rules. Changing them will not mean absence of rule. It will mean having rules that ensure that the environment is protected, people's livelihoods are protected, and it is precisely by dismantling at the national level the rules for environmental protection, livelihood protection, cultural diversity, that the criticism of the World Trade Organization is emerging. There is no growth, there's destruction. There's destruction of the environment and there's destruction of livelihoods. The problem is neither trade officials nor the WTO has yet found a way to keep count of that destruction. And that is why we are calling for a freeze on implementation, for a stopping of any further liberalization till those calculations are done. And if the trade negotiators do not have ability to do social and ecological audits, the movements can help teach them.
Call up your representatives, call up the police department, say it's time to go home. We'll miss you, WTO, undiversified white businessmen from all the world, learning and teaching us to consume. It don't work 'cause there's finite resources on this planet, and we must share instead of eating it all up. Gobble, 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 gobble.
These are true believers. And basically what they believe, I think, is that the economy is everything. The economy is what delivers all the goodies. And that within the economy, in Canada, for example, the Minister of Finance is the biggest honcho going, because he controls the entire budget. And within that finance, the Minister of the Environment owns a tiny sliver of the total budget. Now the belief is that as long as the economy grows, then the environmental part of that will grow as well. And so you've got to support growth constantly in order to keep the environmental portion growing. But that way sees there are no limits. There are no limits to the economy. It's everything, and it can keep growing. Whereas the reality, of course, is the biosphere is everything. And the only legitimate question is how big within the environment can the economy grow before it begins to bump into limits. And of course, we're already hitting limits.
We met up with the youth rally, and we all marched to basically the labor rally, just like the huge rally over near the Space Needle, you know. And then we did that huge march down to the main direct action area. I don't think the WTO is the way to go. They're hurting the environment, they're hurting the people, they're hurting small countries, they're hurting large countries, they're hurting women, they're hurting children, they're hurting everyone. It's just like the epitome of unbalanced capitalism. I'm not sure if it needs to be abolished. People say maybe change it, but I think it would mean what needs to happen is not just profiting big corporations. It needs to profit for everyone, and everyone needs to be involved. They can't just go and make decisions. No one should be able to do that.
Who is this corporate bad guy? It's corporations that deliver, not the critics. Stock shelves, creature comforts, cars, security and safety. So the protesters have a point or two. But let's not forget law and order. And can we trust them to supply cities? Don't be too sure. Besides, aren't corporations us? And now a message from Life's Spectrum. Psst! Hey, two-legged, a mass extinction is underway. It's true. Many birds are in decline. Amphibians and reptiles too. Coral reefs are dying. The old trees have disappeared. Cats vanishing. Many others. It's not good. We know who is behind this. We are not so dumb. We are asking you, care, please. It is your future too.
Well, the World Trade Organization has ruled against the U.S. Endangered Species Act provision that protects sea turtles, and we're here to let the American public know that free trade equals dead sea turtles. As many as 150,000 a year are killed in shrimp fishing nets. We passed a law in this country that required shrimp fishermen in the United States to use a trapdoor to allow the sea turtles to escape. It's very inexpensive, cheap, easy to use. And then we asked that all other countries who wish to sell their shrimp in the United States do the same. 4 Asian countries challenged that at the World Trade Organization. The United States has weakened our Endangered Species Act to allow shrimp to come into this country now from countries that are killing sea turtles. So our U.S. Endangered Species Act has basically been partially eviscerated over this issue.
Joining us right now in our studio is Pat Buchanan, Reform Party presidential candidate. Good to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Dana.
Glad you could make it. When you look at the WTO, you say it's challenging sovereignty. There are those, however, who say absolutely not. It cannot pass laws. It cannot change our laws.
All right, Mr. Clinton has surrendered American sovereignty, and he got the collaboration of Congress. Let's take the sea turtles. Now, whether you agree with the sea turtle laws to protect them or not, these are laws that Americans passed. They were done democratically, and it was an American law, and the WTO comes along and says, out it goes because it violates the principles of free trade. In other words, free trade is above everything. Now, we fought a revolution to tell people over in London, we don't take dictation.
The chilling effect of the World Trade Organization is probably the most damaging impact of all. That it chills our ability to go forward, to be first in the world with a particular auto safety system, or a particular food labeling, or a particular revision of this and that. And that's the global homogenization process, which is euphemistically called harmonization. Look, we have a tradition in this country where we regale self-reliance and community, correct? Globalization is completely antithetical. Globalization induces excessive interdependence and excessive dependency. And they have no limits to that dependence. If you ask the gatistas, as we call them, if you ask the gatistas, you say, what is the limits of global interdependence? They'll say there are no limits. Whatever the corporate market can bear. They don't want any limits because community and self-reliance does exactly what the questioner is implying. It displaces them. It undermines them. To the extent that we can build our own solar units on our homes or buy solar units on our home, we displace sales of Exxon and Peabody coal. To the extent that we can grow more food locally and expand our gardens, we're displacing the giant agribusiness corporations.
I am so proud as a United States Senator to be here with you because I view this gathering with a sense of history. At the beginning of the 1900s, the robber barons rose to power. They trampled over family farmers and wage earners. We made the transition to a national economy, and there was a group of men and women who had the courage, the populace, women, labor, the right to organize, women having the right to vote, and a whole bunch of other progressive justice demands they made, and no one thought they had a chance. But they had a powerful agenda for our country, and they never stopped, and their point was to civilize a national economy. We are here today, a broad coalition to civilize a global economy and say this global economy has got to work for working families, work for the environment, work for family farmers, and work for citizens all across this world.
Just think what's happened in the United States this century with the bioinvasive alien species like the gypsy moth, like the chestnut blight that wiped out the most important tree in the eastern United States practically overnight. Now we have the zebra mussel plague. Here and everywhere we have this incredible damage, over $100 billion a year damage done to our economy by these exotic species. That should scare us into being very careful about introducing new exotic things.
This gas is more than inconvenient. It really hurts, it stings, and it's intended to drive people away from a potentially violent situation. I certainly support the use. I have personally been present at 2 or 3 of these scenes this morning, and I think our officers are exercising remarkable restraint.
It was terrifying, and it was far more violent than necessary. I don't agree with the tear gassing, but I can understand them taking a block, you know, shooting the tear gas and moving the people away a block, but I don't understand why they would trap us and gas us all at once and not give us a place to run. If they wanted us out of there, why didn't they give us a place to run to? I really feel that they were more violent than necessary in a lot of the situations that I was in.
These trade agreements have very little to do with trade. They actually have more to do with sovereignty. And what they do is they shift power away from elected officials to these unelected trade bureaucrats. And you've created this hierarchy, this structure, this power structure of transnational corporations, which which can wipe out any law that they don't like which interferes with profits in any country almost at any time. Most people, they don't know what free trade really means in significant terms. They've only heard the corporate mantra, the corporate press, oh, free trade is good for everybody. But it's free lunch for corporations. It has tremendously high human environmental costs, and it's meant the impoverishment, the destruction of so many lives throughout the developing countries. And it's also had very harmful effects upon people here in the United States. All the corporations go where the military is the most repressive, the environmental laws are the laxest, and where there's the least enforcement of labor rights, because that's where they could super exploit, get the cheapest labor possible, and they don't have to worry about cleaning up their mess, and they can make the most money.
Now what corporations are doing is they're going into the third world and they're ripping off these people's seeds. The seeds that may have been passed on from generation to generation, breeds, indigenous species that grow in that particular area. It is perfect for that climate, is adapted to that area, and these corporations come in and they take these seeds away and they patent them. And under WTO guidelines, once you take it and you patent it, it's yours. And then if the people use it, if the indigenous population that created it use it, their intellectual property has been ripped off by these corporations. They have to pay the corporation to use the seed which their families have developed. I mean, everywhere in the world, indigenous people are being ripped off. Now that's not the only thing that's happening, because as you're ripping off their intellectual property and you're giving that right to corporations, at the same time, all over the world, these corporations are moving into these areas, whether it be in Ecuador or the Amazon or in Southeast Asia, and they're spilling, mine tailings in their water. I was over in Malaysia and I watched the consequences of logging there, its effect upon the longhouse people who could no longer fish in streams because they were filled with the runoff from clear cuts that Japanese corporations, as they clear cut the waters, would just wash the mud into the streams, and it would choke all the fish, and they couldn't even fish in their streams anymore. They couldn't support themselves, so they had to go to work for these corporations. Their way of life had been wiped out, had been destroyed. But at the same time, other corporations will come in and they'll steal the intellectual property from these people, the way they use native plants to heal themselves, the knowledge that they have of the local area, of the flora and fauna. They'll rip it off, they'll take away their way of life, they'll pollute their habitat, they'll dump chemicals in the water, they'll spray herbicides on the land, they'll poison the people, and they'll steal what's theirs. And they'll make it the corporation's property. And that's going on all over the world. That's going on everywhere. And the WTO lends sanction to it.
The protests in Seattle, along with internal squabbling between the U.S. and Europe and between northern and southern nations, temporarily stalled the ambitions of the WTO. However, not so for the international movement against corporate globalization.
Well, Seattle just set off a spark globally, and there were protests, within weeks after that in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and then it just rolled on.
In November 2001, the WTO met again in Doha, Qatar.
What happened in Doha was the WTO got everything that the corporations wanted them to get. They've deepened a new round of talks that'll really limit governments more than they're already able to do, restrain governments more from regulating corporate activity. And will also create a new governance structure in international decision-making that'll put WTO rules prevailing over multilateral environmental agreements, including the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Biosafety Protocol. These are all things that the Doha Declaration has asserted the WTO will become the arbiter of all these issues, and it's extremely dangerous.
Perhaps so. Nevertheless, the WTO has changed, and they claim to have addressed many of the charges leveled against them. For instance, they reversed the ruling on sea turtles. They insist they have more transparency, and at least in one instance do honor the precautionary principle. And they deny the charge that they impinge upon the sovereignty of nations.
What we are saying is we're saying that if we can offer people in developing countries an opportunity to participate in the marketplace, to raise their standard of living, they'll also become more conscious of their environmental situation and pay more attention to that. And that's been shown empirically in many, many cases over the years. Many people think that our services negotiations are aimed at deregulation of the national economy. That's not true. There's a difference between deregulation and liberalization. We're not about deregulation. We're about liberalization. Regulation has to be maintained, particularly in areas where it affects health and safety. In this country, I don't know how anybody could possibly say that the policy of trade policy formulation is undemocratic. Not only have you got the very public debates on these questions that take place in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, which are public forums on these in Washington, but the U.S. government has always been mandated by law to have private sector advisory groups, including NGO private sector advisory groups that counsel the administration on how to pursue trade negotiations and who were required at the end of a trade negotiation to write a public report.
Perhaps so. Still, one wonders.
It came burning hot into my mind, whatever he said and however he flattered. When he got me to his house, he would sell me for a slave.
Still, one wonders.
Well, the solutions are clear. They're not so difficult. I mean, the things that are bringing in the foreign pests and invasive species are things that most places in the world, produce locally and consume regionally. And so relocalization of a lot of those industries, in terms of wood products, in terms of fiber, in terms of food, those three things can be relocalized. In fact, they're only globalized industries because the public subsidies that go into them, direct subsidies for transport, for road building, for port development, for so many things.
Now they're talking about opening them up, transparency, making them a little bit more accountable. Thank you, all those Americans who have mobilized around this issue.